Hi, welcome to the lecture in CTS240, Chapter 5, Project Scope Management. Now we're going to start going into the 10 different uh, management topics. So just thought I'd let you know. So what is Project Scope Management? Let's see if we slide that out of the way. Well, basically, question is, what is scope? Scope is basically all the work involved creating the product for the project and the processes used to create them. Now the question is, okay, what am I delivering? What am I bringing to the table? Well, a deliverable is product that is produced. It could be software, it could be a document, it could be meeting minutes, it could be a lot of different things, but it's what you're tracking work to get done. Now, project scope management includes the processes of defining and controlling what is and what isn't in the project. Now, a whole bunch of terms here, but basically it's, if I'm the processes involved, there's definitely 7 different processes in place. One is planning the scope. So determining what is the scope of the project, what requirements are going to be managed, how do I collect those requirements, how do I, what data am I gathering to define the requirements, documentation, the features, the functions. Then it's once I get all the requirements, then I got to review all that stuff and say, okay, now I got to find the scope. I got to look at the project charter, look at all the requirement documents, organizational structures to kind of pull it all together. Then I create what they call a work breakdown structure, WBS. And it basically is taking the project and breaking it up into smaller and smaller pieces so that you can actually manage the deliverables. And then, of course, somewhere along the line, I got to say, hey, do I have an acceptance plan? Have I verified? Do I have to come up with a set of formalized rules and how to accept a project deliverables? So is it a sign-off sheet? Is it a memo? Is it a meeting? Whatever the case may be, you've got to define those. And then, of course, controlling the scope. I've got to make sure that nothing gets added or subtracted from this scope without me knowing about it as a project manager. Because it may be that I'm going to, adding things to the project scope could change the cost, time frame, schedule. So you just got to make sure you understand what that stuff is. Just give you a rough idea where this project management scope fits into the process in your planning and then your monitoring and controlling stages. They're very early in the project stage before work really gets started. Now, planning scope management, it's kind of says, hey, the project team says, hey, I'm going to use my judgment, meetings. I'm going to set up a bunch of stuff to generate 2 basic things. What is the scope management plan and requirements management plan? Now, the scope management plan is basically just a subset of the project management plan. Now, the scope management plan, it worries about it. It creates that detailed scope statement. How do I create the work breakdown structure? How do I maintain it and approve the work breakdown structure? The acceptance process, the controlling of it. Those are the major pieces. Now, Pimbach says that, hey, it's the conditions or capabilities that must be met for a project or present in the product, service, or result to satisfy an agreed upon agreement or any formally imposed specification. So this management plan are the documents on how the project requirements are going to be analyzed, documented, and managed. How do I collect the requirements? Sometimes they're given to us. Sometimes they're dictated to us. But sometimes I've got to elicit information from users, project managers, key players. I've got to analyze it, write the specification, and validate those requirements. So collecting that is probably one of the more important pieces, but it's also one of the harder pieces to kind of pin down because not everyone is sure all the details at the early part of the project. So what can I do to collect these requirements? So I can do interviews, focus groups, user groups, questionnaire service, observations. I could prototype. I could create a small little working piece and say, hey, is this what I'm looking for? Now, the term benchmarking is I got to compare what I'm trying to do with general, what is acceptable practices. So I'm comparing this to inside or outside the organization, a project similar to, and see how this new project matches up to it. Now, one of the things you want to do is I want to be able to trace all this stuff down. I need a list of requirements, who's doing it, who's responsible for it, and you can just traceability matrix, requirements traceability matrix. It's just a table that lists all the requirements, their attributes, and its existing status. Now, how do I define the scope? Well, the scope basically includes at least the product scope definition, but it's just a document that records the project boundaries, its constraints, what assumptions are being made. So just kind of, it'll reference documents that support those boundaries to making sure that everyone understands what this project is supposed to do. Now, hopefully, as time goes on, the scope becomes clearer and clearer to everybody, but in the beginning part, defining that is really difficult. Rough idea of steps. So here you got, I've got a project charter, upgrades, blah, blah, blah. But then I've got a couple of different versions, on the server side, gives you one thing. So in each of these project scope statements, from version 1, version 2, you've got to get agreement as far as who's doing it and do people buy into it. So now they got the scope. I understand what I'm going to do. Now, how do I manage this? So I've got this elephant out there, and I can't eat an elephant, all in one sitting. So I've got to cut it down into smaller and smaller pieces. A work breakdown structure is just a way of breaking the project up into smaller pieces. So how do I do that? This decomposition is the subdividing the project into smaller pieces. The work package is the smallest piece, and you keep breaking it down until there's just no other way you can break it down. Usually it should be a week or two's worth of effort. And then a scope baseline is once I've got this work breakdown structure, it just says, hey, these are the activities we're doing, and we're going to store all these definitions into what they call a work breakdown structure dictionary. So basically, I'm going to identify all of this information about this project, break it down into smaller and smaller pieces, up until the point we know exactly what each person's going to be doing. And here's just an example of somebody breaking a large project, internet project, down into smaller and smaller pieces. Now, your homework assignment is going to be looking at creating a work breakdown structure based on some basic requirements, but Microsoft Project gives you a way of creating that work breakdown structure and associating a schedule to it. Now, there are several different ways of developing a work breakdown structure. One is an analogy approach. You're doing something similar to something you've already done, and you can just kind of tweak the project. A lot of projects, if you do a lot of them, especially if it's product delivery, you'll get a lot of those similarities. Sometimes it's a totally new one, and I got to say, hey, I may start a top down and say, hey, I got to start with the biggest item in the project and break it down into smaller and smaller pieces, going through that decomposition process. Or the bottom up approach is I talk to all the experts and say, okay, you guys are the ones doing the work. What's involved? And then just kind of roll those up. So that's top down, bottom up. Now, there's a tool called mind mapping, and it's just a way of graphically using tools. I use mind map, but there's several out there, or XMind is another one. So here's an example of mind view, but it basically is just a graphical way of getting that work breakdown structure, and sometimes it's quick and easy to just kind of get it all pieced together. Now, once I've got this work breakdown session, I have to create a document. I got to tell everybody what all these items mean. So I need detailed information about each work breakdown structure item. So that's, and all that gets stuff stored into the dictionary. So it's a unit of work, should only appear in one place. It's the content, it just all the information about it, everything about it, who's working on it, what the definition is, how long it's going to take. So it is the smallest piece in this. Now, team members should be involved because they're the ones that got to buy into doing the work. Each item should be documented in this dictionary, and the work breakdown should got to be flexible enough to make sure that you can handle changes, especially like in numbering conventions or activity ID naming conventions. You want to make sure that if I need to subdivide an activity even further, or something comes up, I can insert it into the plan and without having to renumber the entire plan, which ends up being a really difficult, painful task. Of course, now I got to worry about validating this scope. I've got to say, now that I got all of this work breakdown structure, I've got to come up with, okay, how do I verify that the steps have been completed? And who signs off, who inspects them, who signs off on it. All of those have to be done to make sure that each stage, it could be for the project, could be going between different phases of the project. So it's a way of just making sure you understand who's validating, what the process is, what documentation is going to be in place to have that come into play. Now, definitely large projects, multiple countries, it can be very difficult spanning cultural and country issues. I had a project that had a developer in Germany, 2 developers in France, developers in the United States. And so timeframes, making sure we all agreed on the scope, work breakdown structure, who was managing what the schedule was, all of that stuff becomes just larger issues when you're going across international borders. Now, controlling the scope, that means, hey, I've got to make sure that I can control, I've defined the scope, we've agreed to it. I've got to make sure that I'm controlling what changes are done. Because changes to that scope can influence the project. So you just got to make sure that everybody agrees. Now, if there's any variance, any changes in that scope, that's the difference between what you planned and what your actual performance is. Now, how do I improve feedback? Because I need to make sure I've got feedback from the users. And some of those is, I make sure that I've got a good project selection process. I insist that sponsors are in there, making sure the project team has major roles, making sure you got regular meetings with defined agendas. And I actually deliver something to users and sponsors on a regular basis. We talked a little bit about the agile process. So you're always constantly doing that. But you also want to do that if you're doing a waterfall model. You want to make sure that people see it. Of course, you don't want to promise to deliver something that you can't. And sometimes having users and developers in the same place can help getting feedback. Now, how do I reduce incomplete or changing requirements? Well, I got to make sure I'm following some kind of management requirements process. So I got to make sure any request, they get approved, who approves it. Sometimes you can create different requirements, put them in writing, make sure they're approved and signed off, put them in a database and controlling those requirements. All of those come into play. Make sure there's enough testing. Make sure that the changes to the system are designed. So there's plenty of options. Now, what kind of software can I use to help with this? It varies from word processing to spreadsheets to Microsoft Project. Most of the stuff I use is between Word documents and Microsoft Project. Sometimes action items, and scope changes, they'll have specialized forms to manage that. So hopefully, I know it was quick, but hopefully this gives you a rough idea what's in the chapter. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.